Well, this one has been a long time coming. Here's my review of all the movies I received in the DVD and Blu-ray horror packs of the last several months. Okay, settle in, because this is, I'm afraid, going to be a long one. And that's entirely my own fault. I fell a bit behind on my reviews of these HorrorPack packages and the movies I've received from the packages. And then when HorrorPack announced that they were ending the DVD pack at the end of 2023, I intentionally pushed this review back even further just so I could finish up all of the DVD and Blu-ray horror packs from almost the entire year of 2023 all at once. In fact, I've already reviewed the films from January and February of last year, but we're about to go through and talk about, and I'm going to review everything that HorrorPack sent from March of 2023 to December of 2023. As always, do remember there will be purchase links down in the What's It in case you want to check out any of these films for yourself. That's a good way to get some good movies, support some filmmakers, and support my work on this channel. And as a reminder, or in case you haven't seen my mass review videos before, in which case welcome, the way I'm going to do this is to sort the films into 3 categories. First, here on my left, after I move this stack, I'm going to stack up all of the films that didn't really do it for me. Either they're just plain bad movies, or at least they were bad for me, and they correspond to what I would consider a 1 or 2 star rating. Here in the middle, usually representing the bulk of the movies I review, are the ones I found good but not great. I've said before, I'm pretty easy to please, so I like most of the films that I receive, but I am relatively hard to blow away, so the good to not great sort of 3 to 4 star reviews go here. These are the ones that I do recommend, but they might not be instant classics or new favorites. Like I said, I liked them, maybe didn't love them. They're good, but maybe not great. But then, finally, here on my right, in front of Dr. McCoy, I put the real gold. These are the sort of transcendent great films that are going to correspond to high 4 to 5 star reviews. And these are the ones that I most unreservedly recommend. These really are classics, new favorites, that sort of thing. With all of that in mind, and because this video is going to be quite long enough already, let's drop all the prefatory matter and get right to the reviews. We begin with March of 2023, and the first film that month was Deadly Delivery. This film begins with an urban legend about a pizza delivery killer who murders people who don't tip their pizza guys enough. It then transitions into a story about a guy who owns a pizza chain, and he sets up a competition for people who want to get a job with his company. But what he's really doing is trying to lure the pizza delivery killer so he can film the results. It's a wacky premise for a wacky film. But if you've been around this channel long enough, you'll know that I mentioned in the past, I think a few years ago, a book entitled Tales from the Crust, an anthology of pizza horror. I enjoyed that book, ridiculous though it is. I enjoyed it, in fact, partially because it's ridiculous. And this film, though completely unrelated to it, feels like it would have belonged in that collection. Apparently, pizza horror is becoming a new subgenre, and I'm all for it. No one would be crazy enough to call this a masterpiece, but it is a lot of fun, and so it will be our first entry, presumably of many, into the good category. Next is House of Shadows. This has a pretty stereotypical haunted house setup. Someone inherits a huge house and moves there with her boyfriend. But then she starts seeing ghosts. It's all pretty formulaic, and as such, it has all the elements of a good, if not terribly original, Gothic story. The trouble is, it never quite puts all those pieces together into a coherent whole. Though clearly low budget, it does manage to collect some good pieces. Each of the elements in isolation is not all that bad. But collecting the pieces and assembling them into a whole are not the same thing, and where it fails is in the assembly. And at the end of the day, it's honestly pretty forgettable. I'm still not going to put it into the bottom group because it was still an interesting enough watch, but it's really not a hugely satisfying one. As such, I'm going to put it in the middle, but perhaps toward the lower end of the middle. That brings us to Death Ranch. This film starts as 3 black siblings who are running from the police, and I mention their race because it's relevant to the plot, not because I care personally. Anyway, these 3 siblings take refuge at an abandoned ranch, only to discover some cannibalistic Klansmen are nearby. Things start to seem pretty bad for our trio of heroes, until they eventually turn the tides and take vengeance on their attackers. Objectively speaking, it's not a good movie. The plot is almost non-existent, and Klansmen are such obvious villains that one is tempted to roll one's eyes at the cliché of the whole thing. And as it got started, I was really prepared to dislike it. However, and this is an important however, once it got going, I found I was actually enjoying it. It may not be objectively great, but it is a pretty good homage to blaxploitation films of decades past, and the kills are just too over-the-top and gory enough to be completely entertaining. I'm not going to call it a great film, but it is a lot better than I thought it was going to be, and I'll easily put it, as with the others so far, in the good category. Which brings us to Becky. I had a pretty good idea of what to expect when I watched this. I knew it was going to be a story of a young girl fighting some villains. What I didn't expect was that it would be so incredibly gory and fairly exciting, and that's a good thing. Horror fans have seen some home invasion stories and revenge stories, and pretty much everything this movie has to offer in terms of plot. But where we're going to be impressed in a film like this is if the film, as this one does, treats us to an unexpected visual display. Becky's character in the film isn't entirely likable at first, putting her rebellious teen or preteen angst on full display, but it's a testament to the quality of acting that the character remains entirely believable both at that point and as she ultimately turns into the kind of horror heroine we didn't really know we were all waiting for. Admittedly, the plot is pretty much entirely predictable, with the only surprises being the precise nature of all the kills, and I wasn't entirely impressed by Kevin James as being as horrifying and villainous as his character was meant to be. But these minor flaws don't detract much from what is otherwise an excellent action horror movie. Largely on account of the top-notch gore, this one will be our first honoree in the top category. Next is this double feature of The Watcher and The Skeleton Key. I'm honestly not quite sure why anyone thought to put these particular 2 movies together into a double feature, because they really have very little to do with one another. But since there are just 2, I think we have enough time to discuss both of them. In The Watcher, James Spader portrays an FBI agent being tormented by a serial killer portrayed by Keanu Reeves. The killer sends the agent postcards with photos of his next victim, challenging him to find and save her before it's too late. It's a film few people remember, and most of those who do didn't seem to like it, but I actually thought it was decent. Not great, but decent. It's a bit of a formulaic thriller, but it's worth watching just for performances from James Spader, Marissa Tomei, and a very much against type Keanu Reeves. And then there's The Skeleton Key, the story of a woman who takes a job as a caretaker for an elderly couple in Louisiana, only to find herself in the middle of a mystery involving hoodoo and the home's dark past. This is another one I think a lot of people have forgotten, and it never got really great reviews. And like The Watcher, I admit it's a bit formulaic, but I actually liked this one quite a bit. I'd actually seen it before, although I'd forgotten the title, so I didn't remember having seen it when I opened up the HorrorPack, but it wasn't new to me. But I did rewatch it in the interest of filming this review, and it even held up on a second viewing. I do think it's better the first time around, though, especially because I found the ending surprisingly effective. If you've been around this channel for a while, you know I often complain about the endings of horror movies, but this is one that I think got it right. I'd probably put each of these films in the middle good category on their own, with the Skeleton Key perhaps a bit higher within that category. However, as I like to do, I'm going to consider the set as a whole. And I have to say, the combination of these two movies, however different they may be, provides enough cinematic value, sort of two for the price of one, to earn its way into the top category. Next is Night of the Animated Dead. This is, of course, an animated remake of the classic Night of the Living Dead. And because it's a remake of such a classic, it's difficult to know how to judge it. It probably goes without saying that if one were to compare this directly to the source material, there's no way it could hold up. However, because it's not just a mere remake, but a remake in a new medium, animation, I think there's actually something good going for it. Largely, the story follows the source material, but it's not a shot-for-shot recreation, so it does provide a different perspective on some of the happenings in the story. But it doesn't try to entirely reinvent the classic either. It makes its changes and adds its twists, but clearly maintains respect for its source. That said, while it's a good movie, it would have to be, given that it does follow the same story as the classic, and it is certainly worth watching to see that new perspective on the film that revolutionized the zombie story. I don't think it has quite the same magic something that made the original into a classic. It's good, but I don't know if people will still be watching and analyzing this one for decades, like people have with Night of the Living Dead. Recommended, especially for hardcore Night of the Living Dead fans who might be looking for something just a little bit different. For me, it belongs to the middle. Next is Halloween 2018. This is the first of the recent Halloween trilogy directed by David Gordon Green, who really needs to just stay the hell away from the horror genre in general. However, I have some mixed thoughts about this movie, as with the entire trilogy. This one in particular didn't really bother me, but also didn't really do anything for me. It felt to me a lot like just another Halloween movie, albeit 40 years after the first one. And fair enough. I was happy to watch it, but I found it largely forgettable. It's really the other two films in the trilogy, Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends, that people found memorable, and for largely different reasons. Though they're not part of the HorrorPack, I'll just mention that I thought Halloween Kills was okay. David Gordon Green seems to really like stories that revolve around the entire community coming together to deal with the evil, and to deal with it communally. And there's nothing wrong with that plotline, and I thought Halloween Kills handled it reasonably well. It didn't feel like a Halloween movie, really, but it was an entertaining watch, so I liked it more than a lot of people did. It was Halloween Ends, though, that really screwed the pooch. That was just a giant middle finger in the face of an entire genre, and the less said about it, the better. Unfortunately, I'll also stand on my soapbox for a minute and say that David Gordon Green has not improved his performance in the genre with films like The Exorcist Believer. Anyway, getting back to this one, I'm going to put it in the good category. It's not great, but as long as we ignore the way the trilogy ended up, the first one wasn't terrible either. That brings us to Angel, the first of the HorrorPack exclusive Blu-rays for this batch of reviews. This one's not about an angel in the religious sense. It's about a mysterious person called Angel. It all starts off when a man hires a team of investigators to look into the abandoned town where his daughter went missing. Turns out this mysterious angel person is still there, And that leads to the kind of confrontation we all expect from a horror movie. On some level, this has a lot of the tropes of the slasher subgenre, but it does manage to be just original enough to feel like it's its own thing rather than just another nondescript and replaceable slasher flick. If you're looking specifically for a slasher, you might be a bit disappointed by the relative lack of gore or truly creative kills, but if you're looking for some slasher tropes in a film that tries to do something a bit different despite limited financial resources, I think you might ought to give it a try. It's another clear contender for the middle group. So we seem to be off to a good start. Let's move on to the films from April of 2023. We begin that month with Camp Murder. This is the story of a killer who's been in an institution. When he's allowed to escape and return to the campsite where his murders took place, he's pursued by his caretaker, Dr. Lewis. And honestly, I'm not sure what to make of this one. First of all, if you think it sounds familiar, that's because it is extremely familiar. I'm sure that must be intentional, as even the doctor's name seems like a direct reference to Halloween, from which this movie borrowed heavily, along with Friday the 13th and any number of other recognizable slasher flicks. And that's part of what's difficult about this, because it's really not a very good movie, objectively speaking. The acting isn't the worst I've ever seen, but it's not great. The effects are pretty cheap, although sometimes entertaining. It's clearly made on no real budget, and it's not very original. It's sort of one of those seen one, seen them all kind of slasher movies. However, because it does borrow directly from some of its predecessors, maybe changing Dr. Loomis to Dr. Lewis and so forth, but the references are clearly there, it's self-aware, and it manages to twist some of those tropes around. It ends up being fairly entertaining, even if a fair amount of that entertainment comes not necessarily from the film as an objective standalone thing, but from laughing at some of its more ridiculous points and some of its references. Clearly, this one is best enjoyed during a cheesy movie night, but because it is a good film for that kind of a cheesy movie night, it also belongs to the middle group. They Reach is a film about a young girl who unwittingly summons a demon from some MacGuffin or other, and then with her friends has to save her family and her town from the forces of evil. It's been productively compared to The Goonies and Stranger Things, and it certainly does have that nostalgic youth power kind of appeal. So, while I don't think it's as good as The Goonies or even the first couple seasons of Stranger Things, I think fans of those will find a lot to like here. It alternates between lightheartedness and creepiness and ends up being a film that's thoroughly entertaining, even if it won't completely blow you away. By definition, that's one for the good category. Which brings us to Last of the Grads, a slasher movie. And honestly, that's kind of all you need to know about this one. It's exactly everything we expect from that subgenre. No more, but also no less. It doesn't really break any new ground, but it's reasonably well produced for a low-budget film. I do think the slasher's design is interesting. It's clearly just an off-the-rack Halloween mask, albeit a fairly good one, but somehow it manages to fit the tone of the film quite well. It probably won't be long before this one blends in my mind with all the other slasher movies, but sometimes you're not looking for greatness, you're just looking for a fun movie, and that's exactly what this one gives you. It also belongs in the middle. That brings us to Rage of the Mummy. I love a good mummy movie. Unfortunately, there just aren't enough of them. I don't know if the genre has collectively decided mummies aren't that scary, or really what's going on, but there just aren't that many mummy movies out there. This is one of them. It involves a group of occultists who steal artifacts from a tomb for their own weird purposes, and of course find themselves hunted by the vengeful mummy. Where this movie both succeeds and fails is that I found the lead characters so ridiculous I was rooting for the mummy. This could easily have been really terrible, but the fact that the film clearly doesn't take itself too seriously earns it a lot of points in my book. It includes weird little animated interludes that place it largely in the same genre, I think, as something like Creepshow or Tales from the Crypt. So it's one of those self-aware, low-budget horror films with perhaps more heart than production value, but it's certainly a fun watch as long as you're not expecting perfection. I'll call this a good one. That brings us to Proxy, and I really don't know quite what to say about this one. It's difficult for me to even describe the plot succinctly for you because the plot shifts and morphs several times throughout the film. I will say that the inciting incident occurs when a pregnant woman is brutally attacked on the street and loses her child. In fact, that opening sequence is one of the more brutal things I've watched in quite a while. And I watch a lot of horror movies, so it gets a lot of credit for that scene. And it's also got a scene near the midway point, and I won't describe it in detail because of spoilers, but I will say I completely didn't see it coming. So it has two fairly shocking scenes in it. But between those moments of greatness, it's a painfully slow movie with a meandering plot and shifting point of view that leaves the audience wondering when we're going to even figure out what the movie's actually about. That could be interesting in and of itself. I do love a good slow burn from time to time, and some of the other films I'm going to be discussing in this and in other reviews are slow burns that I love. But the problem here is that the characters, pretty much all of them, are so pathologically broken that it's really difficult to worry too much about what happens to them. Combine that with the fact that this movie has probably about 20 minutes worth of real story crammed, I say, into a 2+ hour runtime, and it's a recipe for boredom, which is a word I rarely use. Now, I'm not saying it's devoid of redeeming value. In addition to the two scenes I mentioned, it does raise some interesting character questions. It just never really follows through with any meaningful answers. I'm going to put it into the middle category, just barely, because I do think it's worth watching once, but I don't think it's going to be a particularly entertaining experience for most audiences. Next is To Your Last Death. I went into this one blind. I had really no idea what I was getting, except that I knew it was animated and had a very impressive voice cast. It ends up being partly a story about an abusive father's death match against his own children, and partly a story about a time-manipulating supernatural entity interfering in the first story. And it ends up being a remarkably entertaining watch. If it has a downside, it's that I don't think the supernatural elements are developed nearly enough. I enjoy some mystery, but I found the supernatural in this movie was used for little more than to drive the plot forward, and I think it could have been improved with some more background. However, the voice acting is top-notch, the writing is overall tight, and the animation, while not my own style of preference, was well done and treats the audience to a thoroughly entertaining hour and a half or so. I'll be putting this one in the middle group. Next is Trapped. This one surprised me a bit. It's the story of a couple whose daughter is kidnapped and held for ransom. But they're not together, if I recall correctly. The husband is on a business trip, leaving the wife with the child. And when the girl is kidnapped, the wife is held by one of the kidnappers at their home, and eventually another member of the sort of crime circle makes contact with the husband who's out of town. Trouble is, for everyone involved, the daughter requires medication the kidnappers didn't know about from their background research, and the whole thing gets out of everyone's control. It's really more of a thriller than a true horror movie, which is part of what caught me off guard, but it certainly has plenty of twists and turns and will definitely keep you in suspense. But the other thing that surprised me is that even though I usually prefer horror to thriller, this one is so well written and so well acted that I have to say it's one of the more successful films I've watched recently, and despite being slightly out of our usual genre, it nevertheless earns a place in the top category. And while we're on the topic of the difference between thrillers and horror movies, that's a difficult question in and of itself, and one I plan on tackling in a future video sometime in the not-too-distant future here on this channel. So with that in mind, this seems like a good time to remind you to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you won't miss out on that or any of my other videos. And while you're at it, do tell a friend or even an acquaintance or an enemy about what I'm doing on this channel. Growing my audience is the best way to make it possible for me to keep making videos for y'all. But this is long enough anyway, so let's get right back to the movie reviews with 73 Minutes. This one takes place almost entirely in a car. Our main character is a lawyer who gets a phone call while driving, telling her that she has 73 minutes, hence the title, to bring one of her case files to someone, or her family will be killed. It's arguably, again, more of a thriller than a true horror movie, and it's clearly low budget. Certain elements of the plot do struggle a bit with plausibility as well. However, it excels at raising the tension right at the start and maintaining it until the end, so I give it a lot of credit for that. It may not be quite as good as the last thriller I discussed a minute ago, but it easily belongs to the good category. And we now move on to May of 2023, beginning with Skinwalker. Here we have a horror western. I've been thinking lately, and I know I'm not alone, my colleague on the Do You Like Scary Movies podcast has said the same thing, that horror westerns might be about to get a lot more popular. Well, here's one more example of what we're talking about. Here we have a hunter who steals a medallion from a Native American burial site and, of course, unwittingly unleashes the Skinwalker. In Navajo lore, a Skinwalker is a kind of shape-shifting witch of sorts. In this movie, it's less human and more like a demonic entity, but either way, it's the kind of nasty you really don't want to meet. Honestly, though, the monster is a bit underused in this movie. It's much more Western than it is horror, and to the extent that horror elements come through, the most noteworthy ones are the ones the human characters inflict upon one another rather than the monster inflicting on the human characters. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean the movie loses focus a bit because it struggles to decide whether it wants to be focused on human or non-human monsters. Regardless, though far from perfect and probably a bit longer than it should be, it is well worth a watch, particularly if you're one of those who thinks horror westerns need more attention than they've gotten in the past. It belongs also to the good category. Next is Killer Therapy. So the basic premise here is that a young man decides to hunt and kill all the therapists he visited in the past and who he blames for making him the way that he is. Admittedly, that's an interesting idea. A lot of y'all know that I have some background in psychology, and though I've never worked as a therapist, I certainly know enough to say with confidence that there are a hell of a lot of incompetent therapists out there, so the premise was intriguing, that this guy's blaming the incompetence of his therapists. But I think where the film falters a bit, aside from the low production value, for which I forgive a low-budget movie, is that it never quite decides whether it wants to be an over-the-top slasher movie or a psychological horror movie. It's not impossible to combine the two, but it is difficult to do so because their tones are often so very different. Here, instead of finding a way to blend the two subgenres together, it seems to just waffle back and forth between the two. I think this actually would have been really great as a short film, but at just over an hour and a half, I don't think there's quite enough here to really justify the length. I'm reluctantly putting this one in my lower category. I didn't completely hate it, but it just didn't really do anything for me. Next is Shark Double Feature. Sharksploitation, the subgenre that just keeps on giving. This is, of course, a double feature of two low-budget sharksploitation films. The first is Bad CGI Sharks, and I mentioned in my earlier video when I opened this up that I'd already seen that movie, and I loved it. It's really everything we want from a movie called Bad CGI Sharks. The second film here is House Shark, and it treats us to something fairly similar. In this case, it's a shark that invades a house, and a ragtag group of heroes, if we dare to use the word, respond to the danger. For me, both are pretty good for what they are. There's no question of fine cinema here, but if you're looking for something that's just plain fun, this double feature is a good one to try. Bad CGI Sharks is by far the better of the two films as far as I'm concerned, but both of them are worth a watch. This one goes into the top category, which also serves as a reminder that I'm not reserving that category only for the deepest of fine cinema, but for all the films that are among the very best at whatever they want to be. In this case, they're just trying to be cheesy fun, and they do it brilliantly. Next is The House on Cuckoo Lane. This is the story of a legendary videotape, a forgotten movie with a dark past. If you're a hardcore movie fan, you've probably heard whispers of some of these kinds of movies. Maybe you even have a holy grail of your own, some movie that you've heard about but is just impossible to find anywhere. Well, that's what The House on Cuckoo Lane is about. It's about a movie fan who actually finds his holy grail. A movie called, appropriately enough, The House on Cuckoo Lane. And it turns out to be cursed. If you think it sounds familiar, it is in fact very similar to John Carpenter's episode of Masters of Horror called Cigarette Burns, which, if you haven't seen it, is a wonderful film that more people really do need to know about. This is a low-budget offering dealing with a similar premise, but without the resources of the Masters of Horror behind it, so don't expect nearly as much in terms of visuals. But the fact that this is a low-budget movie about a low-budget movie makes it quite delightful to watch. It's another one for the good category. Next up is Annabelle Creation. Well, it's another Annabelle movie. I think, if you've been around this channel, I think you pretty much know all that you need to know about it already. And Lord knows I've already shared my thoughts on this franchise a million times here on this channel before. With regards to this one, in particular, it's a prequel to Annabelle, and I have to give it credit where it's due. All of these Conjuring movies have been doing a pretty good job of building a mythology and delivering some decent scares, along with high production value, even if they aren't really doing much to give us anything very new. And this is pretty much on par with the rest of the series, though personally, I think it gets bonus points for not focusing on the Warrens like the other films have. As with the others in the franchise, I'm putting it in the middle. Next, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Emily or Amelie. This one is the story about a babysitter who at first seems perfect to the children in her care. She's the cool babysitter who lets them break all the rules. But it turns out her problems extend beyond mere breaking of parental rules, and she turns out to be something much more sinister. It's a story we've all seen before, but it's rendered fairly well here. One will spend part of one's time watching the movie feeling fairly annoyed by some of the characters' foolish decisions, even given the allowances we make for children being known for not making the best decisions in life. But it does do a pretty good job of keeping the tension high, and the performances are engaging. This is another one for the middle group. And that brings us to The Turning. This one is a sort of gothic story adapted from a Henry James novel, which I'm ashamed to admit I haven't read yet. I reckon I'll have to add that to my reading list. The gist of the story is that our lead character takes a job as a nanny for 2 young children. As often happens in this kind of story, the job seems too good to be true, and the children gradually start to seem strange. As the story progresses, we learn more and more about the secrets the children are keeping regarding what happened at the house previously. Honestly, this is a pretty good one. If you like that kind of classical Gothic story, and I certainly do, this one is going to be right up your alley. It's driven largely by the strength of the performances and has a few good scares, but doesn't over-rely on mere jump scares to build the story. Instead, it focuses on character and atmosphere, and I think it does it well. That's not to say, however, that it's perfect. The writing probably could have been a bit more direct, and reviewers have trashed the film, but I honestly don't understand what they're complaining about. Yes, it's a bit familiar, and sure, the screenplay probably could have used another revision, maybe even 2 more revisions. But I thought it did what it set out to do, and so, for me, it belongs in the good category. Next is Prosper. Here we have the story of a witch from all the way back at the Salem witch trials, who preserves her life and her near immortality by sacrificing young people every 30 years. Of course, she ends up with a group of just those kinds of young people in her proximity, and the movie goes in exactly the direction you think. It's another low-budget movie, and there's not a thing really original about it. I could pretty much tell you the entire story, including even some of the details, just from reading the back of the case, and I could tell you most of the rest of it by the time I was 10 minutes or so into the movie. But, despite being a bit cliched and predictable, it's nevertheless fun to watch. Production value here isn't terribly high, but the filmmakers clearly managed to do a lot within their limited means, and I think they put together something to be proud of. It's not going to make it into anyone's best of the year list or anything, but I think most horror fans will appreciate it, and so it belongs also to the good category. And as the months got warmer, I still stayed inside watching horror movies because I'm just awesome that way. So let's look at what I got in June of 2023. We begin with Chicken's Blood. This is one that's really only for the hardcore indie horror fans, because the production value, well, let's just say it's very indie horror. However, it's also just one of those plots that only the horror genre can deliver. A washed-up wrestler and his friends find themselves in a town run by a gang of drug dealers, which is bad enough until they realize the gang itself is being hunted by a psychotic clown, and now they're caught in the middle. It's not a good movie, but it's my kind of crazy. I can't possibly bring myself to elevate it into the great category, but I will proudly put it in the good because I do think it's worth a watch. Next is H.P. Lovecraft's The Deep Ones. The first thing to get out of the way is to say that despite the title, this is not a direct adaptation of any of Lovecraft's own original works. Rather, it's an entirely new story set in Lovecraft's mythology. And honestly, I'm fairly impressed with it. Lovecraftian horror is notoriously difficult to put on screen because so much of it relies on inner turmoil, and so much of the rest relies on beings that defy description, much less actual depiction on screen. But this one does a pretty good job. It centers on a couple renting a home for a vacation, only to discover the village that they're visiting is run by a Lovecraftian cult. And because a lot of it focuses on the gradual discovery that the villagers aren't what they at first seem to be, it manages to capture at least some of what Lovecraft wrote about. Admittedly, I didn't really care for the ending. Not that it's a bad ending per se, but I do think it falls victim to those difficulties I was talking about with adapting Lovecraftian horror. But especially through the earlier portions of the film, it was quite an enjoyable watch. Another one for the middle group, but in this case, I'm going to say probably the high end thereof. Next is School of the Damned. It's pretty clear, even by the title, that this film lifts heavily from Village of the Damned. Unfortunately, it never quite rises to that level of quality. It does have an interesting premise. A government experiment has resulted in a special class of several children in a hive mind who use their powers to violently keep the rest of the boarding school in order. I like that premise, even if it's not entirely original. The problem is, the longer the film goes on, we find ourselves tumbling down the rabbit hole of an increasingly implausible conspiracy. At the end of the day, I did find it worth a watch, but ultimately fairly forgettable. It's not bad enough to go in the bottom category, so I'll put it in the middle, but I can recommend it only for those of us who really obsess over watching as many horror movies as possible. Most people, it may not be your first choice. Next is Abominable. This one's about a research team that encounters the Yeti in the mountains. And unfortunately, it's one of those rare films whose title supplies its own review. The other film, about which I said that fairly recently, was Jordan Peele's Nope. And while I can't say this one manages to be quite as bad as that particular abomination, I also couldn't really find a whole lot to like about it. The plot doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and the monster, as much as I love a guy in a good monster mask, just doesn't quite do it for me. The sound design was terrible, but then the dialogue wasn't great, so it doesn't really matter if you can hear it or not. It's unfortunately pretty clear this one's going into the bottom category, but with the caveat that I actually think it would be a great film to get drunk and riff MST3K style. So if that's what you're into, this one would be perfect. So it has its place, it's just objectively not good. As you can see, I've just secured another stack of movies because I couldn't fit them all on my table at once, so we're going to continue right along with The First Purge. This is the fourth Purge movie, despite the title, though it is a prequel, so it's the first in the narrative sequence. It focuses on the First Purge, conducted as an isolated regional experiment instead of a national one, as occurs in the later films. But the problem with this franchise is on full display here. After the first movie's success, both financially and artistically, the franchise became increasingly political instead of psychological, and became increasingly stupid along the way. This is far from the worst of that series. That particular dishonor belongs to The Forever Purge, which came after this one, but it's really not very good either. The two of those films together just prove that the franchise seems to have completely run out of steam. I'd honestly forgotten how bad it was until I rewatched it for the purpose of this review. It's another one easily for the bottom category. I don't even feel bad about that one because sometimes I feel bad to put a low budget one in there because I feel proud of the filmmakers for doing a nearly impossible thing on a shoestring budget, and I give them credit for making a movie even if it doesn't really do anything for me. When it comes to The First Purge, they had all the resources of Hollywood behind them. A huge, not by Hollywood standards a huge budget, but a huge budget by our mere mortal standards, and it was still a piece of crap. So I'm pleased to put that one in the lower category. But we're going to move right along with Spree. This is about a guy who's driving for an Uber-like company, or a Lyft-like company, called Spree. But he's also going on a killing spree to try to get more views on his live stream channel. It's incredibly modern and a good, if not entirely original, use of the found footage genre, formatted as a live stream, complete with on-screen commentary from fictitious viewers. The trouble here is, I struggle to find redeeming qualities in any of the characters. Some are clearly supposed to be reprehensible, so that's not necessarily a mistake on the part of the filmmakers, but it also doesn't leave me anything on which to sort of hang my hat when it comes to getting emotionally involved in the story. I think a lot of it is meant to be funny, but the other problem there is I just wasn't laughing. I don't take pleasure in the particular brand of schadenfreude related to watching so-called cringe videos online, and I don't really want to watch actors imitating them in a movie unless there's actually some depth hidden behind those characters' facades, and here there really isn't. They are just as vacuous as the cringe videos all seem to be. There may be some irony in a guy saying so on a YouTube channel, but I don't really think social media is doing us any favors psychologically. And I suppose that is fertile ground for horror movies to explore, but if that's what you're looking for, I honestly think Dashcam did the same thing better, even if for some reason Spree has been getting better reviews from other reviewers. For me, it just didn't work, and unfortunately it's also going into my bottom category, making this perhaps the first time ever I've given such a review to 3 in a row from the HorrorPacks. However, don't worry, because despite a few stinkers in a row, HorrorPack always comes back strong, or at least strong-ish, because the next film is The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. I don't need to repeat what I've already said about the Conjuring franchise, both in this video and elsewhere, because I've gotten a lot of these in the HorrorPacks and I've talked about them elsewhere. Instead, I'll just confine my remarks to this specific film. In this one, we follow the Warrens as they deal with their so-called Devil Made Me Do It case, in which a murderer used his alleged demonic possession as a legal defense in his murder trial. It's a real story, although you don't necessarily get the real story from the way the Warrens told it, and it's a genuinely interesting case, even if it does bear strikingly little resemblance to what the Warrens said about it and what the film portrays. But the movie is decent, as with all the Conjuring movies, even if they did miss an opportunity to lean more heavily into the courtroom drama side of things, as Scott Derrickson did so brilliantly in The Exorcism of Emily Rose, itself based on a true story, in that case, the botched exorcism, if botched is the right word, because that's a whole complicated case, of Annalise Michel. Botched may or may not be the right word, because it's not necessarily the exorcism itself that went wrong, but it certainly ended in tragedy, and the people responsible for the exorcism were certainly not taking care of Annalise in the way that they should have been. Very complicated case, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose is a great movie about it. Anyway, as with all the Conjuring movies so far, I'll put this one in the middle. But I also want to recommend that you should check out a movie called The Devil on Trial on Netflix. It's a documentary about the real case the Conjuring movie is based on, and while it's as sensationalized as any Netflix documentary, it does, by the last few minutes, actually treat the viewer to a fairly even-handed discussion of the case. Next is Fangs Out. Here we have a film about some people who travel internationally to visit a cheap cosmetic surgery clinic. It turns out it's run by vampires. And from there, it goes pretty much exactly as you'd expect. It's the kind of film where people do something stupid, in this case visiting a surgeon whose intake procedure resembles the operation of a smuggler much more than a physician, and then they get what they should have expected from the start. Some of the characters are likable enough to give us someone to root for, and some others are shallow and mindless enough to make the carnage a bit cathartic. But though it's thoroughly entertaining, it never really does anything terribly original or goes anywhere unexpected, so it's another one I'd call good but not great and put into the middle. That brings us, of course, to July 2023, and we start that month with Village of the Vampire. The premise of this one is that a woman travels to this remote village in search of her missing sister. But it turns out the town is controlled by vampires. It's a familiar story and similar to its predecessor in the HorrorPack, but it's a pretty good story. And I feel like the movie itself would have been decent. Maybe not great, but at least decent, maybe even good, except that it was severely harmed by some of the worst English audio dubbing I have ever heard. And unfortunately, I couldn't play it in the original Italian with English subtitles, so that made for a pretty miserable viewing experience. As far as I've been able to discover, it was originally called Caleb in Italian. That's the name of the lead vampire, Caleb. And if you can find that version with English subtitles, or if you speak Italian, I'd certainly recommend the movie itself. It may not be quite top group material, but it would be at least worth watching. As it is, I struggle a bit to know what to do with it because the film itself belongs to the good category, but the audio provided belongs at the very bottom of the bottom category. I'm going to put it in the middle, but understand that I can only really recommend it if you either find the original audio track or if you don't mind the really bad dubbing. Next is Witches of Blackwood. This is another one about a woman visiting a remote village. In this case, she's returned home following her parents' death and finds that the town is in the shadow and under the influence of a coven of witches. And her mother was somehow involved. It feels a bit more like perhaps a dark character study than a real horror movie, or more creepy than scary, something like that. And I certainly appreciate a horror movie that treats witchcraft as something to be feared rather than something for trendy high schoolers to dabble with. But it's another one of those that just doesn't quite feel like it entirely fulfilled its potential. Like I said, it feels like a character study, but it never really gets to the most interesting things about the characters. It treats witchcraft as something dark, but never quite makes it scary, so it's far from perfect. But that's not to say it's bad either. It's what I'd like to call a strong effort that misses the mark, but nevertheless lands close enough to still be entertaining, and therefore it goes to the middle. Next, The Nest. In this film, a young kid gets a teddy bear from a garage sale. Turns out, this is no ordinary teddy bear. It's host to an insectoid monster of sorts, and it gradually takes over everyone in the family. Think of something between a cursed doll story and a pod people story, and you're not too far off the mark. One of the things I really liked is that even though we've seen stories about possession or body snatchers or pod people, we've seen stories about monstrous insects, and we've seen stories about a child bringing something evil into the family's home under the guise of a doll or a teddy bear. Even though we've seen all of those things, the assembly of these elements ends up being not quite like anything I've seen before. It consists entirely of familiar elements, but when you're watching it, you don't feel like you've already seen this movie before, and that's fairly rare in a horror movie for somebody like me who watches horror and reads horror pretty much non-stop. I also love the design of the teddy bear itself. In fact, if any of the filmmakers happen to be watching this video, I want that prop. But at the same time, I also can't say it's perfect. As much as I love a slow burn, I do feel like the movie drags a bit more than it needs to. Maybe not by much, but even just cutting 5 or 10 minutes probably would have made it a bit tighter. So that brings us to the big question. Is it good enough, despite those few flaws, to make it into the top category? My first instinct was to say probably not. But then I did a little bit of digging on IMDb, and I discovered that this film was made on a budget of just $89,000. For a sub-$100,000 budget to even stand a chance of making it into the top category is saying something pretty impressive. And honestly, I have to judge movies, like I mentioned earlier, not only on the final product, but on how well they did with the resources available to them. And that's enough, as it was to push The Purge into the bottom category because of the amazing resources they had. Similarly, that's enough to push this one over the line into the top category because the filmmakers did more with almost no budget than 99% of Hollywood could do with hundreds of millions of dollars. Next is The Butchering. Some people have called this the Irish answer to Scream. I don't think it's quite a fair comparison unless you add in that it was clearly made on a microscopic budget. But if you do keep that in mind, I think there are some similarities in tone between this and the Scream franchise. The premise here is that a killer returns to start another round of murders on the anniversary of his first killing spree. A police officer who survived the first attack is trying to prevent history from repeating itself. Have we seen this a million times before? Not just in Scream, but in damn near literally every slasher movie since the 1970s? Absolutely we have. Is it an entertaining watch anyway? It sure is. And I'll be honest and say that it's not all that memorable and does start to run together in the viewer's mind along with all the other slasher movies out there almost immediately after watching it. But it's still a fun couple of hours, and that earns it a place of honor in the good category. Next is The Craft Legacy. Well, it's a sequel to The Craft. I suspect die-hard fans of the original might find something to like here, if for no other reason than to spend another couple hours in this world. Personally, while I have nothing against the original, I'm not that kind of die-hard fan of it, and so I really didn't find anything particularly interesting about the sequel. The problem really is that there's too much and too little going on, both at the same time. The film is burdened by too many subplots and too little real substance in any of them. In fact, a lot of it ends up feeling more like an after-school special, albeit one with witches, than a real movie. It has the same moralizing plot and cardboard characters one expects of such an after-school special, but without any of the heart one found in the original movie. This one, unfortunately, belongs in the bottom category. I'm sure there's an audience for it out there somewhere, but I am not that audience. Next up is Incarnation. This one is about this young couple. They rent a new house and they move in. They're trying to start their lives together while also getting a new business up and running. But the house is also home to some occult relics. And as they start to investigate those, they find themselves involved with something pretty dark. The demon Mammon. Now, Mammon, of course, is a biblical term that just refers to money. For example, when Christ says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, you cannot serve both God and Mammon. But in the Middle Ages, Mammon became personified and associated not just with money itself, but with a demonic entity who specialized in the evils associated with greed and money. And that's exactly where this movie goes. Because this young couple become influenced by the demonic force to do increasingly evil things in the pursuit of getting their business set up. But what's interesting is that it's not just pure greed. It's also sort of a matter of survival that really starts things off. They need their new restaurant business to be a success, or frankly, they're toast. They're not going to be able to afford this new house that they've moved into. Their lives are going to shut down before they even really get started. These characters are not, at least not initially, looking for trillions of dollars in unearned wealth. They're just looking for honest success. But that becomes corrupted as the film carries on. And I think the filmmakers are trying to make some fairly subtle points there, but they don't entirely come through. So I'm not calling this an unqualified success, but I do think it explores at least some interesting ground, and it's an entertaining watch along the way. Reviewers, both professional critics and audience reviewers, according to Rotten Tomatoes, hated this movie. And I can see why. It's low budget, doesn't fully explain itself, and never quite makes its message clear. But I don't think it's quite a fair criticism either, because as much as I might criticize the movie for losing some of its subtlety, I can also criticize the critics themselves for not realizing that there's a whole world that exists between the 1-star and the 5-star review. This one lies squarely in the middle. It might have been better in potential than in actuality, but there's still something there worth watching. Not everything needs to either be terrible, or perfect. Next is The Intruder. Here we have another young couple moving into a new house. In this case, they buy it from Dennis Quaid's character, who seems to have trouble letting go of the property. The husband thinks he's becoming a dangerous stalker, but the wife thinks he's a harmless, friendly country boy who is just being perhaps a little too familiar. Of course, this being a horror movie, I think we already know which of them turns out to be right. But the problem here is that both of them are completely foolish throughout the entirety of the movie. One other reviewer called it a shout at the screen kind of a movie, and that's exactly right. For example, just one example, let's take the husband. If you suspect that this man might be a dangerous stalker, the one thing you don't ever want to do is tell him directly to his face that you don't allow any guns on your property. Because you already know he's got one, you live in the country, so police are at least 10-15 minutes away, and only a fool advertises his own helplessness. If I thought the filmmakers were trying to make a point about clueless city folk moving into the country, that might be an interesting point to make, but it seems like we're meant to think that he's behaving rationally, because it turns out he's right about so much of the other things that are going on. And that's just one of a laundry list of foolish things that both main characters do throughout the entire movie. All of that became so tiresome that I was just about ready to confine it to the lower category, when lo and behold, the very last shot of the film, just those couple final, maybe 10 seconds or so, turned things around and made me think maybe the filmmakers actually did know what they were doing and were trying to make a point. Of course, the state of the industry being what it is, those redeeming couple of seconds have been pounced upon by some of the critics as a failure, but I'm here to tell you that this movie is full of stupid decisions, plot holes, and cliches, but at least that final resolution, and Quaid's over-the-top performance, I have to say, are really the only things the film has going for it. That brings me to the question of how to rate it. I think I'm still going to have to put it in the bottom category because I'm not sure that a couple of seconds of redemption is quite enough to save a nearly 2-hour movie. But that does at least put it toward the top end of that category. Next up is Loon. And here, once again, we have a young couple moving into a new house that they've inherited. I think we're beginning to detect a bit of a theme in the films that came in this particular horror pack. And once again, it's a remote house in the country. In this case, it's on a lake in Montana. And once again, there's a creepy, overbearing neighbor. This one likes to carry an axe around with him because, he claims, he chops the firewood. Fair enough. If carrying an axe is enough to get someone branded as creepy, well, let's just hope anyone who's afraid of an axe, especially out in the woods, never happens across some of the things I like to collect. But to be fair to the other side, Neighbor Chuck does seem a little strange. I'm not going to spoil much more than that, except to say this is the kind of slow burn horror that I like. There's a sense of menace, but it takes its sweet time in actually getting to the money shot. And I think that's almost invariably scarier than a real gore fest. Not that there's anything wrong with a gore fest. But then we get to the ending. Let's just say I think this ending is going to divide audiences quite a bit. It certainly came out of nowhere, and I can't even decide whether I liked it or completely hated it. Whatever I end up thinking about the ending, though, I'm glad to have seen the movie, and I'll put it in the good category. Moving right along, let's see what I got in August of 2023, beginning with Deadly Playthings. This is an evil doll movie, pretty much like every other evil doll movie out there. I'm not sure if that should count as a point in its favor or a point against it, because I value originality, but there's also something to be said for a film where you know exactly what you're going to get. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't even quite rise to that level. The plot is exactly what you'd expect, but the script is fairly terrible, and the acting and production value are somehow even worse. Look, I like to try to find something nice to say, even about bad movies, when I review them, because I do know a little bit about how hard it is to actually get a movie made, and I do give credit where it's due. Even making a bad movie is an accomplishment most people, even those who aspire to be filmmakers, will never actually achieve. So, hats off for that. But honestly, that's really all the praise I can offer, because it was actually more annoying than entertaining, I'm sorry to say. And I'm sorry to say this is another one for the bottom category. Next is this Bloodsuckers collection. This is an anthology or collection of 4 vampire movies. As is the case with any collection of films, some of them are more successful than others. But because there's just 4 here, I'm going to try to give you a little taste of each one, and we'll begin with The Breed. This one takes place in a world where vampires aren't lone hunters, but a large society trying to integrate peacefully into human society. Unfortunately, there's a rogue vampire killing people, and an FBI agent has to work with other vampires to catch the criminal vampire. It's essentially a buddy cop movie with vampires, but if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, it's not going to disappoint. We then have The Cave, which is kinda what you expect from a film with that title on this collection. It's about some people who get lost while exploring a cave, and it turns out they're not alone. The cave is full of vampires. Honestly, the film got a lot of bad reviews, which it doesn't really deserve. It may not be fine cinema, but it's a pretty good action horror movie that will absolutely keep you entertained. I think the problem is that there's an obvious comparison to be made between this movie and The Descent, and The Descent did it better. That doesn't mean this one is bad, though, so if you can't get enough of subterranean vampires, or at least vampire-like creatures, then you should check it out. Next up is one called The Forsaken. This is one of those cinematic warnings to be careful who you pick up when traveling by road. In this case, the hitchhiker is a vampire hunter, and the characters end up ensnared in the battle between the vampires and the Slayer. And some of our heroes even get infected by the vampire virus themselves. It's another one that seems to have attracted a lot of negative reviews, but I don't think it really deserves them. It's certainly not the most memorable of movies out there, but if you're looking for a vampire road trip movie, you could do a lot worse. Finally, there's a movie called Vampires: The Turning. This one is about a guy trying to rescue his girlfriend who's been kidnapped by an ancient vampire cult. And it's another one that's gotten a lot of negative reviews, but again, I find that rather surprising. The thought I keep coming back to with this one is that it's a lot better than it has any right to be. The script isn't great, the acting is passable, but certainly not something you'd see on the Shakespearean stage, but yet it manages to blend the vampire movie with the martial arts movie in a really fun way. Watch it if you're looking for a good popcorn movie. So, all in all, I wouldn't really call these very scary as horror movies go. They're more horror thriller or horror action hybrids. But all in all, I'd call it a really good collection. Singularly, each of these films would find itself in the good category, albeit perhaps on the high end of the good category. But because I like the extra bang you get for your buck with these collections, I have to say that if we consider the value provided by the entire collection, it just edges its way into the top category. Next is The Fergusons. Well, this wasn't quite what I expected. I knew going in that this was about a family who kill and eat annoying neighbors and petty criminals. And it is that. But I was expecting more of a comedy, and while it does have its funny moments and is certainly on the lighthearted side of things, it didn't really make me laugh. I do think it was meant to be funnier than it is, and that may be partly indicative of the decline in comedy in recent years, but that's a whole other rant for another day. But while I don't think it quite worked as a comedy, it was nevertheless rather an entertaining watch. So if you're looking for something on the silly side, if not actually funny, I'd gladly recommend this one, and it's another one for the middle group. That brings us to Slaughter Drive. This one's about some amateur filmmakers who accidentally record a murder and then find themselves targeted by the killer. And it's another one that's objectively bad, but still has its place. It has all the over-the-top bad acting and fun kills you'd expect from a shot-on-video film, which is exactly what this is. And as such, I'm going to put it in the good category, but with the caveat that I recommend it really only for those who appreciate shot-on-video movies and will understand all the things that make it bad were largely done intentionally as an homage to that genre. Next is Slender Man. So this is about some people trying to debunk the Slender Man, only to become his victims. On some level, it might as well have been called How to Capitalize on the Name of a Popular Monster, because that's really what this is. It doesn't really make use of any of the things that made Slender Man the, let's say, internet phenomenon that he became. Instead, it treats us to a cookie-cutter horror movie with a plot that shrivels away as soon as you look at it too closely, but with some good atmospheric scenes and a high production value. As of the time I wrote my notes for these reviews, it had an 8% critic review and a 16% audience review on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I don't think it's that bad, but I also don't think it's very good. In fact, I have to say it put me to sleep the first time I watched it, so I had to actually try again the next evening, which is not exactly a great testimonial for a horror movie. And unfortunately, though I don't think it's as bad as its reputation, it's still not quite good enough to crawl up from the lower category. Next is Kicking Blood. This is the story of a vampire who falls in love with a human and tries to give up her addiction to blood as a result. It's an interesting idea, and though the addiction to blood as an allegory for addiction to other substances that might plague an individual has been done before, it's used to pretty good effect here. Trouble is, I'm not quite sure what to do with this movie on a horror review video, because as a horror movie, it's a complete failure. It doesn't even try to be scary, despite the use of vampires as its premise. But as a romance movie, or as an allegory for addiction, I think it does pretty well. Ultimately, I'm going to put it in the middle and let y'all decide which way you want to go, depending on whether you're in the mood for more of a vampire drama, or whether you're looking for real horror from your bloodsuckers. Next is The Possession of Hannah Grace. This is another one I'd seen before getting it in the HorrorPack, but I did rewatch it before reviewing it, and my thoughts really haven't changed all that much on a second viewing. The story begins with a botched exorcism that ends with the victim dead, much as in the aforementioned case of Annalise Michel and the film about that, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. The victim's body in this film is then delivered to a morgue where our main character has just taken the night shift as security. Of course, I think we all know what happens next. Well, a lot of people didn't much care for this one, but I don't entirely agree with them. I do agree the script desperately needed another draft because, as is, it's just a little too much the same as every other possession movie. However, it does treat us to some good creepy visuals, and I think with a bit more work on the script, or perhaps in the editing room, it could have been great. As it is, though, it's worth a watch, and it goes into the good category. But if you're looking for a morgue movie that really exceeds expectations, I also want to recommend The Autopsy of Jane Doe. Next is The Frankenstein Syndrome. This is a loose retelling of the Frankenstein story, or maybe we would say it at least deals with some similar themes, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the plot of Mary Shelley's original novel. In this case, it's about an illegal research project into the reanimation of dead tissue. But when one member of the team tries to leave, he's murdered and then reanimated himself as part of the experiment. Initially, he seems like just a vegetable instead of his former self, but he begins to learn and develop rapidly, eventually even acquiring psychic powers, which he then turns against the other researchers. The idea of science creating a monster it can't control is a cliche for good reason, and often makes for a great story. This one isn't bad, although it skews toward the familiar and certainly doesn't live up to its namesake. Not that anything really could live up to its namesake, and as such, don't let that turn you off too much. This one is a pretty average movie, and as such belongs in the very middle of the middle category. Turning our attention now to September, the month in which I celebrated my own birthday, and also the month in which I celebrated receiving the following horror movies. Beginning with Howl from Beyond the Fog. Now this is a bit of an odd one. First of all, it's a kaiju movie, which I always love, but this is a different kind of kaiju movie, and it did some things I've never seen before in terms of the way it pulled off its effects. Rather than having a normal cast of characters and a ton of CGI, as seems to be the way things are done these days, this one went back to the good old days of using a guy in a rubber suit for the monster. But to keep the monster looking suitably large when interacting with the humans, the entire human cast is portrayed by marionettes. And I love that. The story itself is not bad either. It's about a girl and a monster defending her family's land from intruding developers, which may be a bit of a tired-out cliche, but it still makes for an interesting story when presented well, as it is here. And it does take its time to establish characters rather than just giving us scene after scene of monster violence, which I also appreciate. The story itself would probably land in the middle category, but because I appreciate innovation when it's done well, I have to put this one in the top, simply because using a puppet cast and a rubber suit kaiju is such a stroke of genius. Next up is another multi-film entry, and it's called Zombies Unbrained. Here we have one of those multi-film collections, in this case including 12 movies, all of them themed about zombies. And I tend to like these because for the price of just one DVD, you end up getting a whole sample platter of a bunch of films you might not otherwise have seen. And this one provides a pretty good mix. Let me start by just listing out the films it includes. They are Carnival of Souls, Dead Men Walk, Horror of the Zombies, House of the Living Dead, King of the Zombies, The Last Man on Earth, Mutant, Night of the Living Dead, Oasis of the Zombies, The Snake People, Teenage Zombies, and White Zombie. Of course, the downside of these packages is that you almost always get some movies you already had in your collection. I think, for example, I must have at least a couple dozen copies each of Night of the Living Dead and White Zombie at this point. And that's not to say they're not great films. They are. But there's not a whole lot of added value there for a lot of us because we already have them. But on the other hand, you also get some wonderful films that you may not have seen before, and I love that. This one does take some liberty with the word zombie. These all do feature some kind of zombie or undead or something in some manner, but they're not all what we think of as zombies. In fact, the supposed zombies in The Last Man on Earth are actually more like vampires, as that's the Vincent Price adaptation of the novel I Am Legend. And Carnival of Souls, while also a great movie, barely has anything we'd recognize as a zombie. But at the end of the day, I actually think this is a great collection of older films. Yes, there are some duplicates with others already in my collection, but there are a few that were new to me, including a couple that were really great. Combined with the value you get when you receive 12 films for the price of one, this is an easy contender for the top category. Next is Clownado. As if Sharknado weren't enough, now we have Clownado. It's about a bunch of demonic clowns trapped in a tornado, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. If you even think about expecting a good movie out of this, you're out of your damn mind. It's terrible by every possible metric, but if you're in the mood for something so bad it's good, you just might want to give it a look. I'm not sure I'd even go as far as to say it is so bad it's good, because good might be too strong a word, but it's at least so bad that it's thoroughly entertaining. And so I will put it in the middle. Next is Bone Hill Road. I've been saying for a long time that we need more werewolf stories. That goes for horror books as well as horror movies. So I was pretty excited to dive into this one. There's a werewolf on the cover, it says it's about a werewolf, and in fact, the premise here is that a couple of women are trying to flee a domestic abuse situation and find themselves hunted by werewolves. They then flee from that threat directly into the home of a madman who's taken a bunch of women hostage. These might thus prove to be the unluckiest women in the history of horror, fleeing one human monster into the sights of a supernatural one, and then fleeing that into the clutches of another human one. As such, my biggest criticism is frankly that the film tries to do too much and ends up being a bit disjointed. Either the werewolves or the madmen would have made a great story, but the combination of the two just strained credulity a bit too much for my taste, and arguably also stretched the film beyond what its obviously low budget could really cover. However, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Sometimes you find a low budget movie that might objectively have a lot of flaws, but it nevertheless has a lot of heart. And I think this is a good example of that. Maybe I'm just a sucker for a werewolf, but I think that earns it placement in the middle group, despite its flaws. Next is Zombieland, and here's another one I'd already seen, of course, but I was certainly glad to rewatch it for this review. I suspect most of you have probably seen it by now as well, and if you haven't, well, all I really need to say is go watch it. This may not be the best zombie comedy out there, but it is definitely high on the list. It's delightfully charming throughout, gory in all the right places, and often genuinely funny, which, as I mentioned before, is something a lot of comedies these days fail to achieve. If that weren't enough, it also has one of the best cameos ever, and in light of events that were topical several months ago, also contains one of the best single-second shots of any film I've ever seen, which occurs at 18 minutes and 29 seconds. If you know, you know. Anyway, this one belongs in the top category. Next is Detention. This is a kind of horror comedy about a movie slasher, this time called Cinderella, coming to life and hunting people in the real world. It certainly has a lot of shades of Scream in that regard, but it's meant to be more of a horror teen comedy than a real horror movie. And the production value here is actually really good. But I honestly, again, as with some of the others, don't quite know what to do with this one. I've mentioned before a lot of movies that seem objectively bad, but nevertheless entertain me for all the right reasons. This one is kind of the opposite. It's objectively well produced and the script was clearly well thought out, but it's just not for me. I recognize that a lot of the lines and scenes are pop culture references, and I assume if I were young enough to understand them, I might find it entertaining. But to borrow a line from Leslie Knope, the thing about youth culture is, I don't understand it. And the same goes for the plot itself. It's certainly fast-paced, in fact, relentless might be an even better word, but it's also all over the place and goes in some directions even I never would have expected. But I don't necessarily mean that in the best way. But at the same time, I can also acknowledge that this is exactly the kind of movie the TikTok generation would probably love for exactly the reasons it didn't really work for me. So at the end of the day, I don't really know what to do with this one. Objectively, I see a lot of good things in there. Subjectively, it's really not for me. I'm going to go ahead and split the difference with this one and put it in the middle group, but understand that I'm not so much saying people will find this one to be a mediocre or middling film, as I am saying that people will either love or hate it, probably depending upon their age. Next we have Blumhouse's Fantasy Island. Here we have a film in which a small group of people visit a mysterious island where all their fantasies, or rather one specific fantasy each, will come true. Sounds like utopia, no? Well, as is always the case whenever someone promises utopia, in fiction or in the real world in fact, anything that seems to be too good to be true is. In this case, much like in the story of a genie, the fantasies get twisted, things turn dark, and we find ourselves in the middle of a horror story. This one honestly got slaughtered by the critics, boasting a dismal 8% on Rotten Tomatoes. The audience reviewers were a bit more charitable, giving it a 45% average. And honestly, I think the audience reviewers have the right of it here. The critics were expecting a cinematic masterpiece, apparently, which this is not. What it is, rather, is a run-of-the-mill, fairly cliched and formulaic horror movie. Is it going to be anyone's favorite? Probably not. Probably never. But in a genre that, for better or worse, is willing to milk every trope for all it's worth, I can't honestly say this one is really any worse than so many others. It may be largely forgettable, but it will keep you entertained for a couple of hours. Therefore, right into the middle group it goes. Next is The Witching Season. This is a sort of anthology collection of 5 short films centered around the Halloween season. As it came as HorrorPack's exclusive for September, it was just in time for the October horror Halloween viewing season, and that's really where this one shines. On its own merit, just as a movie, it's a kind of middle-of-the-road collection of low-budget shorts. They're not bad, but they're not necessarily the most effective or memorable either. However, for those of us who can't get enough Halloween movies for the October viewing season, this was just what the doctor ordered. There are plenty of homages to classic horror films or filmmakers, a few good scares, and some delightful seasonal spooks. I wouldn't really recommend it for non-holiday viewing, but it's definitely earned its place in my Halloween lineup. This one is going to belong to the middle category. And now we move on to the month of October and the movies I received therein. The spooky season, the month when the evenings start to get cooler and everyone gets ready for Halloween. It's the time when even the normal people watch horror movies, and I was all kinds of excited to dig in and see what kinds of tricks or treats the HorrorPack people would send me for October of 2023. And the first one was this, Paranormal Activity 4. This is actually the first of 2 Paranormal Activity movies in this month's pack. And since my thoughts on the franchise largely hold across both of these films, I'll start with some general thoughts here, and then I can be a bit briefer for the next one. To begin with, I'm a fan of the early films in the franchise. The first was excellent, the second was pretty good, and the third was, while not as good as the first, maybe actually even a bit better than the second. It was this fourth one, though, where I think the series really started to lose its footing. It does have a few good creepy scenes, but it was in this film that the franchise's mythology started getting way too big and way too convoluted. I'm actually a bit conflicted about this one because I think it belongs either toward the bottom end of the middle category or the top end of the bottom one. It's right on the cusp. But until I figure that out, I suppose I better lean a little on the side of generosity, and I'll put it in the middle. Next came Amityville Clown House. Well, what do you say about this movie? It's what you expect. There are tons of ludicrous Amityville spin-offs these days, including such modern classics as Amityville Bigfoot Amityville vibrator, Amityville in space, Amityville backpack, and now this Amityville clown house. I certainly haven't seen them all, but I stand rather in awe of this endless stream of Amityville movies, often fitting into the so bad they're good category. And this is certainly one of those. It's not good by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're one of those who likes to laugh along with a cheesy movie, or if you're on a quest to somehow watch all of these Amityville spin-offs, even though they seem to be making them even faster than I can watch them, this might be just the movie for you. I'm going to put it in the good category, but with the understanding that it's really not good, it's just fun. Next is Roger Corman Monsters. Here's another of those multi-film collections. This last year seemed to deliver quite a few of those from the HorrorPacks, and in general, I'm all in favor of it. This one in particular is a collection of 6 monster movies by the master of rapid film production, Roger Corman. This is the guy who made the original Little Shop of Horrors in just a few days, pretty much on a bet because they had a leftover set from a previous film. And as a matter of fact, that's the very first movie on this collection, followed by Attack of the Giant Leeches, The Wasp Woman, Creature from the Haunted Sea, She-Gods of Shark Reef, and Beast from Haunted Cave. To call most of these great, or even good, would be a bit of an overstatement. But they are great examples of a kind of movie we just don't see that much anymore, and frankly, I miss these old creature features. Of course I have to put this one in the top category. Anything else would be an insult to Roger Corman. That brings us to Bone Jangles. With a title like Bone Jangles, you know you're in for a certain kind of a movie. And it's probably either going to be horrendously unwatchable or thoroughly entertaining. In this case, Bone Jangles himself is an immortal serial killer, and some police officers are transferring him to another prison facility. Unfortunately, they're doing so on the night when, following a witch's curse from the town's past, the dead walk the earth. As the townspeople take shelter, Bone Jangles and the witch each go on a rampage, and everyone's only hope seems to be to pit the two supernatural beings against one another. And yeah, it's a wild ride. I will admit it took me a while to get into it. The beginning wasn't really all that interesting to me, but once things got going, it became clear that this movie was going to become increasingly bonkers. And on that note, it didn't disappoint. It's another one of those that's nowhere near good, objectively speaking, but it's certainly a fun watch and belongs in the middle. The next one was the other Paranormal Activity, Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension. And now we come to the 5th in the Paranormal Activity films, and since I already shared some general thoughts about the franchise, all I have to do is decide what to say about this one in particular. On the positive side, I think it might have worked a bit better as a standalone film because the plot is a bit more cohesive and the characters a bit more likable than in some of the other films in the series. However, it also leans heavily into the expanded mythology that plagued the 4th film and honestly delivers the least scares in the series, and the scares it does deliver are, I think, the least effective. For that reason, I share the same dilemma about this one as with the 4th one. But since I went with the middle group on that one, I'm going to go the other way and put this one in the bottom. But I'm really just splitting the difference here because I consider them both on about the same level, albeit for slightly different reasons. So those could easily be reversed, and I wouldn't disagree. That brings us to Spell. This is about a man flying with his family, and when their plane crashes, he wakes up in the house of a woman who seems to have rescued him. But his family's nowhere to be found, and he quickly realizes he's not been rescued so much as trapped. And the old woman isn't just a friendly good Samaritan, as she at first seems, but a hoodoo practitioner who claims to be nursing him back to health using something she calls the boogity. Personally, I love a good hoodoo story, and I quite enjoy the clash of cultures that occurs when city folk end up spending some time in the country. Unfortunately, horror movies, particularly the Hollywood ones, the indies tend to do a little bit better, are a little too quick to assume that city equals good and rural equals backwards and evil, which is certainly not the case. There's good and bad about both cultures. This one does lean into that backwards rural sort of mythology a little bit, but it does so with a fairly even hand and with characters that are interesting and engaging all the way around. It opens some issues that it never quite takes the time to resolve, so it's far from perfect, and I'll be the first to admit the beginning is better than the ending, but it's still an entertaining film. It probably doesn't really belong in the top category, but I'm going to put it there anyway, particularly because I love the setting and the folk mythology and the hoodoo storyline, and also partly because Loretta Devine's performance as Miss Eloise just really stole the show in that film. The next one was Disturbia. This is one I had seen before, but I didn't actually have a copy in my collection, and of course I did re-watch it to refresh my memory before making this review. And my memory of it largely held true. I didn't remember all the details, but I did remember it as a decent and fairly tense thriller with a fairly interesting premise. In this case, the premise is that a young man is under house arrest, and while watching Neighbors, because he has nothing else to do while under house arrest, he becomes convinced that one of his neighbors is a serial killer. It's a little formulaic, but the premise is just interesting enough to hold the viewer's attention as it gets underway, and it's well produced enough to maintain tension throughout, so I'd call it another solid entry in the good category. The reason you just saw the piles shift is I just shifted things over to make a little bit more space in the good category so I don't bury myself in DVDs. So just for reference, these are still the good ones, these are the top ones, and these are the bottom ones over here. And I will put more good ones here in this empty space. But never mind all that. Let's carry on with the reviews with Obstacle Corpse. This one has a pretty simple premise. People gather to compete at an obstacle course, but half of them are planning to murder the other half. I'll be honest, when I started watching it, I really kinda hated it. The premise seemed just too over the top, and the characters weren't interesting enough to root for, nor loathsome enough to root against. But I'll admit that as it went on, it grew on me a little bit. All my objections still stand, but it actually manages to be a bit more engaging once you get through the first 20 or 30 minutes or so, and it does earn itself a place in the middle category, but maybe on the lower end thereof. We're getting close to the end now. Thanks for bearing with this long review video. Next up are the films from November of 2023, beginning with A Deadly Place. This is another collection, in this case of 10 films. As I've mentioned, I tend to like these because they're samplers of films I might not otherwise get to see. But in the interest of brevity here, I don't want to spend too much time discussing each film on its own. So instead, I'll try to stick to giving some generic thoughts about the package as a whole. One of the things that surprised me is that, unlike the majority of these kinds of bundles that I've seen in the past, the films in here are relatively recent. Not like they're brand new, but these aren't all old public domain black and white classics or pseudo-classics. So also, unlike a lot of these bundles, we're not getting the same half a dozen films included pretty much every time somebody wants to put out a sampler pack. And yes, I'm looking at you, Night of the Living Dead. But anyway, most of these films are actually from the 1990s, with a few exceptions, so it's a different batch than usual. Just for reference, the films included are Cardiac Arrest from 2004, The Dead Hate the Living from 1999, Don't Go in the House from 1980, Shrunken Heads from 1994, With Friends Like These from 1990, Day of the Animals from 1977, which is actually a Leslie Nielsen film before he got into comedies. Then there's Deadly Instincts from 1997, Grimm from 1995, Tunnels from 1988, and You're Driving Me Crazy from 1990. And to try to sum up my thoughts as succinctly as possible, it's a mixed bag. A couple of the films are great, a couple didn't do anything for me, and most are somewhere in the middle. Worth watching, but not life-changing. By sort of averaging the quality, I would put it in the middle. However, as I've done before, I'm going to put it in the top because even though not all the films are perfect, some of them do stand out and some of them might actually be at least border on top level quality. And because getting 10 movies for the price of one is almost always going to be a great value. Next is Jekyll and Hyde. This is just what it claims to be. It's not a modern interpretation or a new retelling of the story or a reimagining or anything like that. This is meant to be a faithful adaptation of the Robert Louis Stevenson novella. And it pretty much is that. Before I get too deep into it, I should mention the director was a recent guest on my Do You Like Scary Movies podcast, and one of the cast members was a guest on the same podcast a couple years ago. So even though I didn't know it when I first opened up the HorrorPack, I'm actually somewhat acquainted with the people behind the scenes of this one. It was quite a pleasant surprise when I started watching it and suddenly realized, oh hey, Jed's in this one. Putting that aside, I was a little afraid when I started watching it and realized that the title card was misspelled, putting a C in Dr. Jekyll's name. However, while mistakes like that do indicate its micro-budget origins, and it certainly was a micro-budget production, the film itself actually does a decent job of telling the story in a reasonably faithful manner, and for that, I'll put it in the good category, no questions asked. Next is Ouija Shark. Here's another one of those cheesy movies in which the title tells you everything you need to know. It's about a Ouija board that summons a spirit shark. Fair enough. I'm not expecting a masterpiece here, but it sounds like it should be a fun time. And most of the film is pretty much what you'd expect. It's terrible by every possible objective metric, but perhaps entertaining if you're in the right sort of mood. But then it comes to the end. The ending appends one of the most ham-fisted, non-sequitur attempts at topical humor that I have ever seen in my life. And honestly, it kind of kills the whole thing. This is a movie about a Ouija shark. It doesn't need to date itself or piss off half of its audience with political humor. And the fact that not only did they go there, but they went there so poorly, really just, it left a foul taste in my mouth. If I'm going to enjoy this kind of movie, it's because I want pure mindless escapism. Topical humor doesn't do that. This one might have made it into my middle category, but the ending was so bad, I just can't bring myself to elevate it above the bottom. The ending just pissed me off that much. Next is Dollhouse. Turns out I'd actually seen this one before I got the HorrorPack. I didn't remember having done so based on just the title and cover, which might seem like a damning sort of statement, but honestly, there are just so many creepy doll movies that I lost track. Once I started watching the movie, I did remember it. This one's about a care home for runaway children with a mute caretaker who accepts a young girl who brings her dollhouse with her. Turns out she doesn't like to speak either. And of course, this being a horror movie, people start dying, and it seems like they're being trapped by some supernatural means inside the dollhouse. Objectively speaking, it perhaps tries to do a bit more than it should, and ends up not fully developing some other ideas as a result. But honestly, it's still a good watch. It's nothing terribly original, but if you like a good haunted dollhouse, I think you'll enjoy it. It belongs, of course, in the middle category. Rings, of course, is obviously a sequel to The Ring, and an attempt to bring that story into the digital age, as the cursed video ends up on the internet instead of a VHS tape. When I read the description for this one on the back, I was conflicted between thinking how terrifying it would be if that video did end up going viral, but also thinking that that would ultimately kill whatever magic made the original film, and that's true whether we're talking about the English or the Japanese version, whatever ended up making those so effective. And I'm sorry to say, but the latter interpretation ends up being the one that carries the day in this case. For one thing, it's not even the same tape. This film introduces a new tape through a fairly convoluted plot mechanism that doesn't really work and doesn't seem necessary, and ends up treating us to a movie where the viewer already knows what the evil is, at least in broad strokes, and has to wait while the characters catch up. Dramatic irony, of course, has its place and can be used to great effect, but here it breeds more boredom than tension. The thing of it is, if I considered this as a standalone movie, I'd probably end up putting it in the good but not great category, sort of forgettable but okay. But it's not a standalone. It's a sequel to a modern classic of the genre, and it had all of Hollywood's resources behind it, so one can't really use a low budget as an excuse for lack of performance. And that's the biggest problem, ultimately. It's just not scary. Now, that's not always a metric by which to judge movies, since I'm damn near impossible to scare, but The Ring was at least scary in theory. This one really isn't, and so I'm going to put it, unfortunately, in the bottom. That brings us to Kill Her Goats. As with a lot of the others I've been discussing, all I really need to say for you to understand the plot of this movie is, it's a slasher. In this case, it's a bunch of girls visiting a friend who just inherited a new house, and they're stalked by a masked killer. Great, we know what to expect. Another way to put it is this movie is what you get when you cast a bunch of former Playboy models in the lead roles, then add Kane Hodder to the mix because you need a horror legend, and throw in some goats because why the hell not? Importantly, you do everything with only practical effects and avoid CGI at all costs. Well, that's exactly what this film did, and that's exactly what this film is. On those notes, it's glorious. Is it good? Not even a little bit, but it's a delightful throwback to some of the best slashers we've ever seen, and the production value is high enough that it could actually pull off everything that it was trying to do. I also quite like that the HorrorPack came with this collector's edition that also included a sticker and some little postcards or things like postcards. So there's even that extra bit of value in this particular edition. This is a slasher movie as a slasher movie ought to be, and I'm going to put it in the top category. Moving to something completely different, we have Nazi Undead. Believe it or not, given the title, this isn't just another Nazi zombie movie, and honestly, thank God for that, because I'm really kind of getting tired of Nazi zombies. Yeah, I understand why they're effective, but they've been done to death, or to undeath. But this isn't a zombie, it's a ghost, so we're at least getting something a little bit different here. In fact, what we actually get, in addition to the ghost story, is a weird and repetitive Groundhog Day kind of horror, and I'm all in favor of that. I certainly don't understand, though, why they had to invoke the spirit of an SS soldier to tell that story. The connections with Nazi atrocities are tenuous at best, and I think further confuse what's already a somewhat complicated story. And I don't think it needs to be a complicated story. Another revision of the script probably could have made it a lot tighter and more effective. But as it is, it's still a worthy effort and a decent, if flawed, film, and so it's going into the middle. And then the November exclusive was Dude Bro Party Massacre 3. When I opened this one up, I mentioned that I'd recently had some of the filmmakers on my Do You Like Scary Movies podcast. So let me begin by just reminding you to check that out. There's a link down in the What's It, and we talked to a lot of interesting horror kinds of people, including these people. But as for the film itself, well, a good place to start is that it's called Dude Bro Party Massacre 3, and there is no part 1 or part 2. I think that does a pretty good job of letting you know what kind of movie this is. It's the kind of movie that, if you're expecting a good movie for some reason, will severely disappoint you. But if you're in on the joke, and if you're familiar with the kind of cheesy horror movie this is meant to satirize, I think you'll have a blast. I can't bring myself to call it a new favorite or anything, but it easily belongs to the good category. And finally, the last month on our docket for this evening is December of 2023. I got a nice collection of Christmas presents from the HorrorPack people, beginning with Hell on the Shelf. Now, given the title and the cover of this movie, you'd be forgiven for expecting, as I did, that this is about an evil elf-on-a-shelf doll that comes to life and kills people. It's not. In fact, title and cover art aside, it's nothing to do with the Christmas season at all. Okay, there's a Christmas elf in it, but it's not an elf on the shelf. And that was rather disappointing for me, because it came in the December HorrorPack, and I was hoping for a seasonal horror movie. There is this elf doll I mentioned, and technically it's a Christmas elf doll, and that's the MacGuffin around which much of the action centers. But it's just a generic Christmas elf doll. It's not the elf on a shelf, and it doesn't, as far as I could tell, even take place during the Christmas season. And a lot of what happens ends up feeling like a generic haunted doll movie. There are scenes in which the doll seems to move when people aren't looking, for instance. Throw in a generic ghost hunters find a real ghost kind of a plot line, and you pretty much know exactly what you're in for. There is a twist toward the end that I did not see coming, but it's not the kind of twist that seriously alters the viewer's experience of the film. It's really not great, but as is my way, I probably would have been generous and put it in the middle, because I like even not great horror movies. I pretty much like anything to do with horror. Except, in this case, its marketing made me expect something so different from what I got that I felt a bit ripped off and misled. So I'm going to have to put it in the bottom for that reason. The film itself, I'd put in the middle, but because it's nothing like what you see on the cover, it's nothing to do with Elf on a Shelf, I'm going to put it in the bottom to encourage more honest marketing. Next is The Curse of Dracula. This one's about a group of guys who are going to, without permission from the owner, sneak tours of tourists and sightseers and paranormal enthusiasts into a mansion rumored to have once belonged not to Dracula himself, but to Dracula's cousin. But the mansion also seems to be inhabited by a saw-wielding maniac who starts killing the guests. I probably should be just as disappointed by this one as I was the previous one, because there's no Dracula. There's no Dracula's cousin. There's not even actually a vampire. But what actually is picking off all these tourists is something I completely didn't expect, but which also makes sense within the film's mythology. And I like when a film takes me someplace I haven't been before. So I will warn you that if you're looking for a Dracula film, this is going to disappoint you. But since I was just looking for a good horror film and didn't much care who or what the villain was, I was plenty happy with it. Some of the kills are rather inventive, and the characters are interesting, if not always likable. So it's not a movie that I've heard many people talking about, but I think it's a good one, and I'll put it in the good category. The next was another copy of the Bloodsuckers collection. When I opened this one up, I thought it seemed familiar, but I couldn't remember where I had picked it up. I couldn't remember if it came from a HorrorPack previously, or if I'd picked it up at the dollar store or whatever. It did end up being a duplicate from a previous month, and I'm not sure what happened there. It's the only duplicate I've ever received from the HorrorPack people, but since I've already reviewed it, I'm not going to do so again. I put that one in the top category, and the repeat just ended up in the box of duplicate books and movies I've come across for eventual sale on eBay or to give as gifts or whatever I end up doing with them. Next, though, was The Haunting of Borley Manor. This one is about a wounded soldier sent to recover at a remote cottage from which he can monitor German transmissions during the war. While there, he starts to experience something supernatural and calls upon investigator Harry Price to assist. So I suppose the best place to start is with Price himself, because he was a real person. He was a paranormal investigator. Beginning in the late teens or early 1920s, with an interest in stage magic, he began following the path of other magicians like Harry Houdini and David P. Abbott in investigating paranormal claims and psychic mediums. Like many of these magicians, he debunked plenty of fraudulent psychics. It's a field that's still active today, with magicians such as myself using their skills in skeptical paranormal investigations. But unlike a lot of his colleagues, Price actually endorsed a small number of mediums as genuine. And one of the cases for which he became famous was none other than the Borley Rectory in Essex, which he described as the most haunted house in England. Though it is worth noting that the Society for Psychical Research rejected most of his reports on the matter. Regardless, that's the backstory for this movie. The film itself is a low-budget, character-driven, slow burn of a ghost story, which presents a highly fictionalized version of the Borley haunting. Even if we take Price's reports at face value, the film takes plenty of liberties in the interest of presenting a coherent narrative in just a couple of hours. And if we take the SPR at their word, the whole thing is pretty much made up in the first place. But that the movie doesn't follow the true story to a T doesn't mean it's a bad movie. It's actually pretty good. It lacks some of the scares that I want from a real horror movie, but it's certainly an entertaining ghost story with just enough of a real story behind it to make it that maybe little bit more interesting. Borley Rectory itself was demolished in 1944, so there's not really any hope of doing more research on the subject now, but if you're looking for a good ghost story, the movie should please. It belongs to the good category. Next is Spiral. This is the Chris Rock Saw movie. I suspect a lot of you have probably already seen this one, so my comments will be brief. Before I saw it, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. I thought the Saw franchise had basically already said everything it could possibly have to say, and I thought Chris Rock, though one of the very best at what he usually does, was an unusual person for the franchise. But I was wrong. It turns out he knew exactly what he was doing and treated us to a film that follows a bit of a tangential plotline when compared to the rest of the franchise, but nevertheless largely maintains the tone of the series, even if it leans a little more to the police procedural side of things than most of the other Saw films have. Now, a few years later, it's obviously got to be compared to Saw X, which came out last year, which is assuredly the superior of the late Saw sequels. But I still think this one has some value, and I'm happy to put it toward the high end of my middle group. Next is Evil Bong. I mentioned when I opened this package that I am not a part of the stoner subculture, so I was concerned this film might not be for me. It is, as the title suggests, about an evil bong that traps its users in some kind of alternate dimension. It does feature Tommy Chong, which I thought might be something of a saving grace because, as stupid as he comes across when I've seen him interviewed, he did at least make some funny movies back in the day. Well, the fact of the matter is, he plays a fairly small part in this movie. He did deliver a couple lines that made me laugh, but the unfortunate thing is, only he delivered any lines that made me laugh, and he only delivered one or two of them. The movie has the level of production value you'd expect from this sort of thing, so there aren't really any technical flaws. It's not like it's a high-budget movie, but it's professional, and I suspect there are those who will love it. If you're immersed in the culture it's talking about, it's probably going to be funny to you. But I'm not, so it isn't to me. Apparently, this movie sparked an entire franchise, and let's just say I'm not rushing out to buy the sequels. It's exactly what you expect it to be, in other words, which might be a great movie for some people, but it's simply not for me, and so I'm putting it in the bottom, but some people will probably like it anyway. Credit at least for being completely upfront about what it is. Then there's The Hand That Feeds the Dead. This is a re-release of a 1974 Turkish-Italian film starring Klaus Kinski as a mad scientist who's been experimenting on facial transfers to restore his deformed wife's appearance. And it's pretty much what you expect from a 70s Italian Klaus Kinski horror film, for better and for worse. All of which is to say, this is far from a cinematic masterpiece, but if you like the films of that period, you're probably going to love this one because it really ticks all of the boxes of the films of that period. I don't always find myself as enamored of this particular cinematic style or period as many of my fellow horror fans do, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate it when it's done well. And here, though the story's entirely familiar and probably drags on a bit longer than it needs to, it's done well overall. It also belongs to the middle category. And then, Fog City. We conclude this review video with this odd HorrorPack exclusive. This is the last one, and I've already prattled on for far too long, so I'll be as brief as I can while also giving the film its due. In this one, we've got a group of friends at a vacation home when they take shelter from this mysterious orange fog that's leaking from a nearby factory. Turns out the factory is owned by one of their friends' father. Tensions rise as they're trapped inside. What really makes it great is that it's not immediately clear what the fog is. No idea whether it's anything to worry about or not. But some of the characters start to believe it is something to worry about, and furthermore, they start to believe it's infectious, and we end up in one of those situations where the viewer doesn't actually know what's going on, and neither do the characters, but the distrust between the characters itself becomes the monster. It's clearly low budget, and some of the acting is inconsistent, and I was hoping the fog itself would look a little better than it does. But the writing is fairly tight, the characters are alternatively likable and unlikable at the right moments, and it brings itself to a satisfying ending. So I'm actually going to go ahead and put this one in the top category. Admittedly, I'm probably being a bit over-generous there, but it's at least a plausible rating and a good way to end on a high note. So that does it. Those represent pretty close to all the horror movies I got from HorrorPack last year, except for the first couple of months, which I reviewed in a previous video. And honestly, it's another good batch. Plenty in the good category, several in the great category, and a relative few in the not for me category. I am, of course, sorry to say that these represent the last of the DVD horror packs, but the Blu-ray packs will continue, and I'll be reviewing those shortly. As I mentioned elsewhere, I'm transitioning into a new format whereby I review the Blu-ray packs month by month instead of all at once like this, so be on the lookout for my reviews of the January 2024 horror pack shortly. But with all of that having been said, like I said earlier, I have prattled on way too long, so it's time for me to sign off. I hope you find some of these films of interest to you. Do be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share to help me grow this channel. And as always, take care and stay scared.